ongoing conversations I'm having with fellow social scientist Manuel Galvan. And this one is going to be about men's issues. So I think we should just dive right in and start by first showing this video, this trailer for a documentary by Tucker Carlson. So when Manuel and I first talked about doing this, this wasn't on my radar. Somehow it came up. It must have been the gods, pointing this in my direction, because it's very appropriate, right? We're talking about men's issues, and here's this guy politicizing an issue, in I think a negative way. Maybe you do too. So let's watch this, and then I'll get Manuel's comments on it. So let's see here.
They produce men who are tough.
Let me start from the beginning. I mean, look at that. I mean, come on, man.
Once a society collapses, then you're in hard times. Well, hard iron sharpens iron, as they say, and those hard times inevitably produce men who are tough, men who are resourceful, men who are strong enough to survive. And then they go on to re-establish order, and so the cycle begins again.
It's just weird, man. It's just really weird. It's really something. So what do you think about that?
I did not anticipate starting being on a video that would start with a Tucker Carlson clip.
That's right. I took you by surprise. I know.
But kind of funny. Definitely. I mean, we were just talking about how people online have mentioned how there's like ironically some homoerotic imagery in the video, which I think is kind of interesting. Who knows why that is? As far as like the message, that message strikes me as like problematic. The idea that like hard times need hard men to deal with those problems. There seems to be like a weird insinuation that I think is consistent with a certain like very right-wing ideologies that like we need to have like tough, angry people to deal with the difficulties of society, and society is becoming soft now because there's so many like rights and some, you know what I mean? Like it feeds into that kind of narrative. So I think that's where they're headed. I guess we'd have to watch the documentary, which I don't think I would, but yeah.
Yeah, it's basically saying you need some broad-shouldered, blonde, white men to establish order, because all the wokies have just made things crazy. That seems to be what's. But it's just okay. So I think so. People are lampooning this, and you'd expect that. And I guess Tucker expects that. But I think it's going to speak to people who are already watching his show and liking what he says. It's going to speak to heterosexual, Christian conservative white men. I think that's what's going to happen, and so I bet it's going to be a successful, in terms of views and all that stuff. It's going to be a successful thing. I don't like. So to me, it's politicizing something, weaponizing something that I think there's some reality is on the ground, and that's kind of what we'll talk about. And maybe we'll disagree on that. I think that there are some issues with men that need to be discussed, but Tucker Carlson is a propagandist, so he takes those like realities on the ground and spins them into a narrative so that it benefits the far right. So let's kind of jump in. And you know what? I didn't ask you to introduce yourself, which I guess I should have done. So I mean, tell us who you are.
Yeah, my name is Manuel Galvan. I'm a third-year social psychology grad student at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I also do science communication stuff, similar to Rod, and he's kind of been an inspiration to me, so I appreciate you having me on the show. And I write on a blog called scienceofsocialproblems.com. I have a couple YouTube videos, and I have now started a podcast called A Bit More Complicated. with a scholar named Dylan Seltzerman, who's on vacation right now, but we're going to be recording another episode this next week talking about political polarization and also symmetry versus asymmetry. If the left and right are symmetrical in the way that they handle their psychological profiles, or if they're asymmetrical. So check that out if you have an opportunity. And you can find me at Sci Social Probs. It's on the screen. But yeah.
So that's a great title, by the way, a bit more complicated. And I imagine a very fitting because, I mean, it usually is a bit more complicated than how we tend to talk about it. And so my brief, 80,000 foot view of what you're doing is that it's a very high end type of product that you're putting out. Let me cut this off so it won't make noise. It's a very high end type of product. In other words, I do social science communication. I have a Substack, and I write a column which is very political, but I try to make it. I try to include sociology, and then I have a Substack where I try to go a little bit more in depth. But even then, I'm really simplifying it down. And so it's very like someone who is just new to social science can kind of read and go, oh, okay, I see. Maybe that's what's happening with you. But when I saw your YouTube video a while back, and the way that you're describing this, it seems like it really goes more in depth, and a person really gets to the meat of a lot of what social science is about.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I try to get in the weeds, but I also try to do it in a way that, like, you don't have to have a PhD to get, and you don't have to be in a PhD program. I mean, it's a skill I think a lot of academics don't have or don't develop, is like, how do you speak to a person who's not an academic about the things that you care about? So I try to, work those muscles and try to develop that way of doing things.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, I wish you the best of luck, man. I'm sure it's gonna be pretty good, or it is a good.
Thanks.
You've already done some already, so
yeah.
All right. Well, let's dive in here. We came up with these questions, and we'll start with those, and we'll see where it takes us. So, what evidence is there, Manuel, that men are facing challenges unique to them?
Yeah, I think this is a question that I like posing sometimes to my lefty friends, is like, are there issues that men uniquely deal with and are struggling with? What can you think of them? What are they? And it helps kind of get people to, often I feel like some of my lefty friends are like, I don't know, or they don't have exactly an answer, or the gut reaction is to say, well, like, men are the dominant people in society, so why are we talking about their issues? And I think those are both somewhat fair responses, and I don't blame people for having those initial reactions. I do have a list of things that have come to mind for me before, and that I've looked up the statistics on to make sure that they are indeed true, because there are. I mean, I think something we should note at the beginning is there is what's called the men's rights activism area of social discourse, and there's also a kind of manosphere, which I know you've talked about a little bit. So maybe your audience knows about it, but just in case people aren't super aware, there are people who kind of overblow the extent to which that there are men's issues, and then they talk about real men's issues in addition to like not so real, kind of based on misinformation, men's issues, and they kind of put it all together in a way that a lot of men see, and they're like, oh man, society is against men, is kind of the thing that they come away from that interaction with. And I think that's, again, it's a bit more complicated than that. Society's not against men. It's just that there are things that are unique challenges for men. So I have a list of some, I'm sure you do too. I'm curious to see where we'll diverge or where we have the same things. So I can just give one and we can talk about it. Okay. One is that men are charged and imprisoned and often given longer prison sentences in comparison to women. So there's a gender disparity there, similar to the disparity between white and black people whenever they go for prison sentences as well, that black people will get longer prison sentences for the same crimes. And it's kind of a similar situation for men and women in the policing situation.
Right. That's true. That's what I've seen. And I looked that up too, and so I don't have to talk too much about it. It's important though. I think Manuel does the same thing that I would do, is go to sources that you can trust. And so the United States Sentencing Commission came to that conclusion. So I'm not entirely sure where Manuel's getting his information from, but that's correct. Men, for the same crimes or similar crimes, men are given longer sentences. So, okay, that's one thing. Yeah.
One thing to keep in mind, of course, on that topic is a lot of people will say in reaction to that, well, that's because men are doing the most crime. But for those of us who have like had these conversations also about, disparities for Black and white Americans, that's not a great response. And we know that that's not a great response.
If you say, well, Black people are committing more crimes, all of a sudden you look like, hey, what are you saying here?
Right. When it gets into that area, we recognize that that's not a great response. And the other reason why it's not a great response is for people who are going to prison, those are still disproportionately Black men that we're talking about who are more likely to end up in prison than women. So we still have like that kind of racial thing going on in those statistics where men are more likely to get imprisoned. So the idea is like we need a fair prison system where it doesn't matter what your demographic features are, that you get treated fairly and the same as everybody else. So people kind of pivot, I think, on that point. And it is important. If there's a disparity, that's an unfair disparity, we need to talk about it. We need to do something about it. Also, the other thing about like criminality as being the thing that is resulting in these disparities in imprisonment, what are the social conditions that are making somebody more likely to commit a crime, if it is indeed the case that men are more likely to commit crimes? I also feel like this is a lefty tendency to be like, to deny that there is a disparity in any criminal behavior between white and Black people on average, right? Certainly, like people in the same SES conditions and stuff like that, they probably have the same rates of criminality. In fact, I think there's some evidence that like, white people use drugs at a higher rate than Black people.
Yeah.
But like if you put people in a community and you take away all their resources and you make it so that they can't trust the police and you do all the things that we know are going to increase somebody's tendency to engage in criminal behavior, they're gonna have a higher, disproportionate amount of criminal behavior because they don't have access to good jobs, they don't have access to a good economic situation. And so this is kind of, put people in desperate situations, they act in a desperate manner. I'm not saying, I'm talking more about the racial disparities in criminal behavior, but we could have a similar conversation about gender disparities in criminal behavior too. What are the social conditions that make men act differently in terms of their aggression, in terms of their behavior? And so I want to talk about that later when we get into, what are the causes of these disparities, but I just wanted to note that.
Okay.
Here's another one. Men make up the majority of people serving in the most dangerous jobs, including the military and including policing.
Okay, I knew that, but I didn't see that as a challenge. Like they're choosing to do that. They want to do that. It's something that they probably would prefer than maybe sitting behind a desk.
Yeah, that's a really good response. One, it's like self-selected. In fact, there might even be evidence that women are like discriminated against in some of these professions, that they're not allowed to enter into like construction as easily, and it's hard to get those jobs. The other thing is there's definitely evidence within the military specifically that women are sexually assaulted at much higher rates than men.
Yeah.
And if I had a daughter, I wouldn't be telling her to join the military with the current situation with sexual assault in the military. So I do think there's just all these factors that go into that. But that's another thing that like kind of the manosphere MRA types will bring up, is that men, are the ones who are most likely to die on the job because they're serving in these really dangerous capacities in the economy. Okay, so another one, men are entering and completing college at rates lower than men.
There you go. Yes, I saw that too. In fact, you can get this from the census. So this isn't some think tank from the right, spewing this information. I mean, this is just standard knowledge, which also bugs me too. If I try to bring this up, then I'll get these odd responses from the left about how that's not true. I mean, it's just very obvious. So if you look at the census, I have the rates here. It's a disparity that isn't as big as I think and people may lead you to believe, but it is a disparity. It's a 53. So adults age 25 or older, that's usually when people finish their college education. With the bachelor's degree, 53% were women and 47% were men. So that's a 6 percentage point disparity. I mean, it's not, you don't stop the world from that, but I think the idea is that it's growing. And so it's problematic. So I have those stats too.
Yeah, and I'm pulling them from Pew, and I should also say, and I'm happy to give you all these links so that people can fact check anything that we're saying, because I'm hyperlinking everything that I'm saying, and you could take it back to its source and you could double check it. I might be wrong. At the end of the day, neither one of us, as far as I know, are gender researchers. We're kind of doing the best we can with our general skills of navigating scientific information to bring that to you all. But if something's wrong, then fact check us. I can provide all of this to Rod, and I can even tweet it out or whatever. But where I'm looking at the education data is Pew. And yeah, for a long time, women were behind men in terms of college graduation, but they've started to pull ahead in the last couple decades. So the other thing to note here, though, is that about a third of men who haven't completed a 4-year college degree say they just didn't want to. Right? Like, this is the response for why they haven't. And so that's like where the biggest, that's a very big gender gap. A lot of women don't say that. A lot of men do say that. And men are less likely to say they can't afford a 4-year degree, for example. So it's not exactly only social conditions. It's also just choices here that men are probably have like other opportunities that they're using, or they're relying on other sources of income rather than getting a college education to make money.
Okay.
So that's also from the Pew data. Here's another one, and this one is also complicated. Men are more likely to be the victims of violent crime.
Oh, okay. Well, I would expect that, but I never thought about it that way. Right. I mean, it's just something that never comes in your head, Okay. Right. What are the stats on that?
So, specifically, like, I don't have the specific number, but basically it's just that men are more likely to be the victims of violent crimes.
Okay.
But the thing that any kind of sane person would point out is, sure, but men are also more likely to perpetrate violent crimes, right? So, like, it makes sense that if you are likely to perpetrate violent crimes, you're more likely to be a victim of said violent crimes. Like if you're involved in a gang activity or something, right? You're going to be more likely to jump somebody, but you're also more likely to be jumped as a consequence of your activities. And so really you can think of there being a ratio, right? What's your chance of being the victim, and what's your chance of being the perpetrator? And actually, there's a gender gap. There's a decline in the gender gap in violent victimization. So there's this really interesting study that comes out of the Iowa Public Policy Center that that women are more likely to the difference between men and women's rates of victimization is actually smaller, but let me start over. So men are more likely to engage in violent behavior and women than women. And women are also, by the same token, less likely to be victimized, but the gaps are actually disproportionate. So men are more likely to engage in violent behavior, and they're more likely to be victims, but the gap is smaller than you would expect based on men's behavior. So what that basically means is that women are kind of getting the raw end of this deal in general. So it's not, the fact that men are more likely to be victims of violent crimes has very much everything to do with the fact that they're more likely to be violent themselves, I guess. Okay. Is the end result of that study.
Well, let me throw one out here, because we built a case here for there being disparities or differences. And you're living up to the name of your podcast by making it a bit more complicated. Another one for me is the suicide statistics.
Right.
And so I'm getting this from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. So I don't think they have a ideological bias.
Right. And
so men died by suicide, according to them, about 4 times more than women. So it's 3.88, but I'll just round up. 4 times more. That is a huge disparity. 4 times more. in 2020, and it was concentrated within white males. So, of all the suicide deaths in 2020, 70% were white males.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a problem that needs to be addressed and it needs to be discussed. I mean, maybe we can do something with mental health or whatnot. We will talk about the reasons and what to do later, but that is a disparity that I don't think gets a lot of play.
Absolutely. Yeah. So some color there, I guess, adding the bit more complicated bit to it as well. Women are more likely to attempt suicide, but men are more likely to die of suicide. And partially the reason there is that women tend to use non-lethal means to attempt to kill themselves. So like women will like cut themselves, or they'll like take pills that will then end up at the hospital, and then they end up not dying, when men are more likely to kind of put a gun in their mouths and end themselves that way. So yeah, men are just more likely to actually die as a consequence of attempting suicide. As far as the white men specifically, there's been some really good, interesting research on so-called deaths of despair.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Which is the literature that I know about that seems to paint a really good picture about why that's happening, specifically suicides amongst white men. Not only that, but substance abuse, suicide, and I think alcoholism.
That's another disparities. Those are other disparities as well.
Yeah, substance abuse certainly is a bigger problem with men than with women.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think this could, to some extent, be traced back to risk taking as well, and we're going to get into this when we talk a little bit about toxic masculinity as well. So, this is just, the color here is just the explanation as well. It's like there's no way to. I don't have
okay. Well, we've done a good job of establishing that there's something at least to talk about. So we started with Tucker Carlson giving this weird politicized view about, the death of men, or we need, men to retain order or maintain order or something like that. This kind
Which is just it's like very separate from what we're talking about. We're talking about like the challenges that men deal with. And he's kind of like putting men on this like godly pedestal that they need to save society or something, which is super weird.
That's right. And it's very problematic because it's quite possible. I haven't watched many of his shows, but I know he's talked about the decline of testosterone in men. I've seen clips of that. Mm-hmm. So there's always some empirical reality out there. Then what you do is you put your political spin on it, which is what he's doing here. Yeah. And so what we're trying to do is a little different. We want to talk about that empirical reality in a more real, nuanced way. And I think that we're doing that. So let's kind of go a little bit to some of the reasons why we see those disparities in suicide, drugs, and sentencing, and violence, and all that stuff. Are men their own worst enemy?
What did you have in mind when you wrote this?
Well, because, all right, when I bring this up, which I have done before, the response is always, well, this is what men are doing wrong, which you have kind of done here. You've described the disparities in terms of the agency that men have and the choices they're making, and those choices are usually bad, and so that's the reason why we have this, right? And so that's why I decided to take that approach.
Gotcha.
But you may not agree with that. You may say, well, no, there are other reasons why this is happening.
Yeah, so people, feminists, basically, when asked about these issues, like, this is a long-standing dialogue, I think, in feminist circles, right? Of like, what are the reasons for these issues, to the extent that some people will discuss them or acknowledge them. And I think I think there's a misperception of feminists that like they don't care about these issues, or they think that men deserve these outcomes somehow or something like that. That's not my perception from my time talking to feminists. My perception is that
sorry, something was in my throat. Something was in my throat. Sorry about that. Continue.
Yeah, but interested to discuss more with your coughing there. But my interpretation of feminist discussions of these topics is that there is a term for this, which we could call as a component of like what they would call patriarchy, or we could just say like the cultural syndrome of like gender dynamics in society, is toxic masculinity. And I think a lot of people perceive toxic masculinity as just a word to describe how much they hate men, basically, which I don't think is really the way that that term is intended to be. I think it describes a collection of male behaviors or men's behaviors that are harmful to men and society and women at large. And it includes a bunch of different factors. Before we jump into exactly what toxic masculinity is, I guess I'm curious, like, what's your perception of that term and it as important, or maybe not important, explanatory factor for the outcomes that we were talking about?
Okay. Thanks for the question. So, all right. I started by saying that Tucker Carlson politicized some empirical realities and turned it into this weird narrative. I don't think that the left is immune to that. So I think that there is a reality out there that researchers have acknowledged and documented, where you've got some male behaviors that, taken to the extreme, are damaging. Hyper-competitiveness, hyper-individualism. I'm using hyper in all of these because they don't always have to be bad, right? But if they're, hyper stoicism, I guess, and so, okay, we can see not only logically, but I think also in a lot of qualitative research, how this hurts men.
Yeah.
Okay, that's toxic masculinity. However, it gets politicized into this weird type thing where if men say that there's anything wrong, there's any kind of gender disparity that disadvantages men, then it's like, well, it's just toxic masculinity. Just change, right? It turns into this thing. So I think there's some reality to it, and it's worth studying. We should just study it more. But when it filters out of academia, it turns into something I think is actually damaging to the discourse.
So, yeah, I think this happens a lot with academia terminology in general. Something that makes sense within the literature and takes on a certain meaning leaves academia, enters into the public conversation, and then is kind of misused and takes on a new meaning that it wasn't intended to. I think we saw a similar thing with microaggressions, where microaggressions was originally, proffered as something that could be done unintentionally or intentionally. And I think the unintentional aspect got lost a little bit for some people, where it was like, oh, if you did a microaggression, it's because you were trying to hurt somebody or something. And it's like, well, that's actually opposite of what the original term was intended to get across, which is that it could be done unintentionally. Anyway, so I think this happens quite a bit in academia, where a term starts there and then moves out and takes on a new meaning. And it's possible that similar thing has happened to toxic masculinity, certainly, as a way to basically blame an individual for what is a social and sociological phenomena, right? I don't construct what is masculinity. Society does, and as a low power person in society, I have very little control over the construction of masculinity as a cultural narrative. And so I do choose whether to enact certain aspects of masculinity or not. But, one's tendency to do that or not is shaped by a lot of other factors that are kind of out of your control. So I don't like it as a way to blame an individual for their behavior. I do like it as a sociological condition that explains behavior, if that makes sense, if that distinction seems meaningful. Yeah,
it does. I'd also like to add that what often happens is that instead of toxic masculinity identifying extreme behaviors, it starts to be all men's behaviors. Like if you happen so behaviors that should be seen as normal, like competition, all of a sudden, well, you want to win this prize, you want to be number one, and see, that's toxic masculinity. And I think that's what tends to happen. At least what I see on social media. And I think that's also problematic, because then the guy who wants to be competitive is like, well, okay, can I do this, without being, deviant or something?
Yeah, I do think there's a, what's the term? There's a dividing line problem where it is there is a gray area here, right, where there is competition that is worth having and is not harmful, but then it can easily turn into, even if it's just, I want to win first place, so I'm going to go harass somebody online, one of my competitors online.
Right.
That's not good. Or I'm going to, shit talk them while they're doing their part of the competition. Like, that's not good. So yeah, it's a tough line to know exactly when you've deviated from like a good form of masculinity into something that could be described as toxic. And I don't think, I think a lot of people don't necessarily draw that line the right way, or the way that I would agree with.
And it's hard to draw because it's a very subjective, qualitative thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit more about like, what are the behaviors? I'm curious if we are aligning on what are the behaviors of toxic masculinity, and so I'd like to go through a few that I have written down. Okay. One of them is like what I would call just excessive social dominance, which is like people who really think of themselves as alpha males, put people into categories as far as alpha, beta, sigma, whatever the hell that is.
Okay. Well, all right. So this might be a good time to do a little pushback. What's wrong with that?
What's wrong with, so the primary thing that's wrong with the alpha beta discussion is that it's not based on any scientific reality, right? So even the person who developed the term alpha and beta did it initially in wolves and then found out that that didn't even apply to wolves. It doesn't apply to humans. There's no evidence that there's any alpha beta humans. The primary reason being that people are more or less dominant in different scenarios, right? So I might be very like quiet and non-dominant in a sporting scenario, but if you sit me at a D&D table, I'm the most dominant guy around because I'm role playing and I feel really comfortable in this scenario to be a more dominant person.
I see.
The problem with it is that it like creates an overall category of who's dominant versus who isn't without taking into consideration context.
Okay, fair enough. Well, let me ask this then. Suppose you've got this young woman who says, I want to be, what is it? A girl boss.
A girl boss, yeah. I mean, I don't like girl boss concept.
Okay, because I was going to say that's the analogy here. It's a category that someone's aspiring to. They want to be a girl boss, but you're saying that, okay, the same rules apply there. You can be a boss in some areas, but you're not essentially a girl boss. This type of thing.
Yeah, and a lot of feminists are criticizing that as well. A lot of feminist women are. There's a meme out there right now about girl boss, gatekeep, gaslight. Right? It's like the idea that like it's basically those are toxic femininity are being called out, right? Because a lot of what is called girl bossing is actually just like shitty behavior towards other people. Okay. And so it is kind of called out as well. And that's like the meme around it, which is kind of funny.
I see. I didn't know that. All right. So social dominance is one. What's another?
Oh, excessive social dominance. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong, especially. And the other thing I like, maybe this is something we could talk about too, is like, it takes a lot for me to tell a woman, be less assertive. Like you have to really be doing a lot. You have to really be like rubbing people the wrong way for me to be like, maybe you should be less assertive. Because I do feel like there is this tendency, there's this like cultural prescription for women to be more docile, to be less assertive. And you have to fight back against that. And to fight back against that means you have to be a little bit more assertive. So if you're the person who talks the most in class and you're a woman, I feel differently than if you're the person who dominates conversation and you're a man in that same class. Because I think that you're trying to correct for, historical tendencies. Yeah,
that's important. So, I mean, that's something. So you're arguing for social context, the historical context, and that will, weight things in certain ways. So you may be more critical of a man than a woman. I get that. And that's something that happens a lot with racial issues and also with sexuality issues, homosexuality, heterosexuality. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Another big one is there's kind of a misogynistic sexual conquest. This comes up in like the pickup artistry world and reducing women to kind of sexual objects that can be won or lost. I think that's like a very toxic tendency amongst men that we could call a component of toxic masculinity.
Yeah, I think so too. The sexual objectification of women. And it's weird because, actually, no, it's not weird. To me, that's the most damaging one. but it's still like the others in that it is only when you do it to excess. So which might be a little sticky here, but I think that if you want to have sex with someone, you have to see them as a sexual object.
I see what you mean. I think
so. I
think consent is the big thing, right? Some women, some not even just women, men, women, and any non-binary individual or whatever might want to be treated as a sexual object within the context of a consensual sexual relationship. That's right. Up to them, right? But to initially treat somebody this way without any understanding of their preferences or consent from them is like very problematic.
That's right. And to reduce them just to that and not see this as, okay, we're about to engage in some things. And so, yeah, definitely. Sure. Okay.
Homophobia is a big one.
I didn't put that in the toxic masculinity thing, but I guess it makes sense.
It's so big, man. I remember growing up as a kid, just like anytime you don't meet the masculine criteria, then you get the F slur thrown at you.
There's a term for this, hegemonic masculinity. So there's masculinity, but then there's also these ideal traits of being a man that curiously, this I think, Raywin Connell, I hope that's right, but it's something like that. This is the person who came with this. This is an Australian researcher. They said that, even homosexual men hold up these ideals. Like they support that system, some without even knowing it, but they see that as, so even they see that as the epitome of masculinity. Yeah. So that's quite interesting. Yeah. Okay. I guess I can see that.
Using violence to gain status and solve social problems that people encounter. So like, I don't like what you did. And instead of let's have a conversation and me try to convince you that what you did is wrong and don't do it again, I'm just going to hit you.
That's not right. You can't do that?
You can't do that. Since when?
I mean, sometimes you have to do, you have to, say, hey, I'm just joking. I'm just joking a little.
I mean, I'm not going to say like violence never has its place. In the face of violence, like violence can be your only option. But in a civilized society, the ideal is to not engage in violence to solve problems, period. So yeah, that's another one. I think there's a really complicated conversation around risk taking and toxic masculinity. We've already talked about kind of the negative sides of it, right? Like being a drug addict, committing suicide. These are, you're just taking risks. You're doing things impulsively without really thinking about what the risk you're undergoing. And I think that underlies some of this, but obviously there are positive risks as well. In fact, I work with a really erudite scholar, Natasha Dwell, and she has this really interesting paper about positive risk-taking in adolescence and how it, risk-taking has this bad rap, but it's also the thing that leads a student to raising their hand in the classroom and asking a question when they might otherwise have been embarrassed to do so. It's also the thing that like leads them to join a group of friends by walking up to them at the lunch table and saying, hey, we've never met, like making social connections. Like so many of the things that are a part of the good life are the consequence of risk-taking. But and so that I wouldn't call any of that, toxic masculinity, but there are just a bunch of bad, what I would call negative risks and what we could also just call like reckless behavior, often to gain status.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you could list 30 things, and I would probably agree with all 30 with the proviso that it's taken to the extreme.
Yeah.
Right. So it's which I think is how it should work. I mean, there are no behaviors. There are few behaviors, I should say, where they're always all bad. So it's a matter of
we've already covered one of them, homophobia, right? Like there's no level of homophobia that is good.
That's right. That's right. So that's true. Here's
another one that I think doesn't have any level of good quality to it, which is not seeking help, not engaging in help-seeking behavior.
Yes. I think that can be good. I mean, it's one thing because sometimes you have to be self-reliant, and so you need to practice that behavier.
I guess I meant more in like a therapeutic and like medical setting.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. Well, even then, if I have to play the devil's advocate, I mean,
like Munchausen's syndrome is like the worst. You know, I don't know if you're familiar with that syndrome, but it's basically somebody. Go ahead.
Is sort of like you're always thinking that there's something wrong with you?
Oh, well, that's another one. No, Munchausen syndrome is you're obsessed with medical attention, and like you fake being ill so that you can get a doctor to pay attention to you. And
I see. Well, I'm not even talking about an illness. I'm just saying that, you know, sometimes it's good, even with mental health issues, to say, okay, is there anything that I can do myself? Can I take responsibility for this on my own? Now, a lot of times that's wrong, but I'm saying that sometimes that's a possible good thing.
Well, that's not intention with seeking help, right? Like you can do the things you need to do on your own to make yourself better and also seek help simultaneously. Like they aren't intention.
Okay, fair enough. Now look, what we're doing here is we're arguing, I guess is the subtext, that these traits are what's causing the disparities.
Yeah.
Is that what's happening here?
I will say this social condition of having these like expectations of men, because again, like nobody decides that like homophobia is good. They just enact a social role, which includes that. And I think like the persistence of that, of toxic masculinity as a cultural condition leads to a lot of these negative behaviors, right? So why are men engaged in more aggressive behavior? Why are they like doing things that lands them in prison? Often it's because they're using violence to gain status and to solve whatever problems they have in their lives. And so that's the connect, right? Mm-hmm. We could talk about, we talked about not completing college, but if you're constantly kind of like not engaging with schoolwork because it's seen as like not a very masculine thing to do, and instead you're kind of doing sports, or you're just trying to have sex as much as you can in high school or college, then you're kind of steering yourself away from completing the things that would help you improve in your academics.
This is what I think, Manuel.
Mm-hmm.
I think that in a very intelligent way, you are doing what I noticed on Twitter, which is blaming men for their problems. In other words, you mentioned the education and how, a man, because of toxic masculinity, things that they didn't create, but they inherited. I agree with that. They are choosing to try and go out on a date or play football or something instead of studying. And that's what's leading to poor educational attainment. I would argue that another way of thinking about this, instead of blaming those young men, is to say that the educational system needs to shift a little bit to deal with whatever it is that these young men want to do. Maybe the way that we're teaching or the way our educational system is set up is just not appealing to them. I mean, it's the same if I was talking about women not going into STEM fields. One could make the bad argument that they're just simply choosing not to do it, right? They don't want to do it. Or we could say, maybe there's something going on in our school system that is pushing women away from those STEM fields. Instead of blaming women, you're blaming our institutions. I think you're doing that a little bit, blaming men.
I mean, I'm happy to, if there's things we can do to change the school system to make them more palatable and friendly to men, like I'm all ears to hear those. Is there something you had in mind, or I'm not opposed to that, but I just think like this is what's in, like we could kind of go down the rabbit hole of looking at the research literature, but the research literature, as I pointed out with a few results, like men just don't want to do college. Like to a large extent, that's a big reason why they don't want to. And so, yeah.
All right. Well, we'll probably, when we get to the last question about what can social science do, then maybe I can revisit that.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, is there a feminine analog to toxic masculinity?
You got a devious smile on, Rod. What's that smile?
Well, no, I just want to know what you think, because I'll go ahead and start. So the same way I think that the traits that we attribute to men, taken to the extreme, are bad. I don't see why we can't say that the traits that are attributed to women knowing that these aren't essentially about men and women, but that's just historically what we've linked with men and women. I'm not entirely sure why we can't say that some traits we have linked to women, taken to the extreme, can't also be bad.
Yeah, I think I'm on board. And I also hear people talk about, we already talked about this already, like the gatekeep, gaslight, girl boss thing is a critique of a toxic form of femininity, usually also embedded in a critique of capitalism. And so I think you're right that there is a feminine analog to toxic masculinity, in the same way that toxic masculinity is a collection of bad traits that are foisted upon men. There is a collection of bad traits that are foisted upon women by society. And so I think we have kind of talked a little bit about one of them, right? Like docility, being quiet in social scenarios, being unopinionated. Like that's not a good trait. And it's kind of just foisted on women and makes them behave in a way that is like not assertive, doesn't get them into the positions they want to be in. That's the kind of, I think we could talk about that as a form of like toxic femininity as well.
Yeah, I think taking to the extreme, docility is bad. I mean, there's something to be said for going along, get along. You don't want too many cooks in the pot and all that stuff. Is that how it works? Cook chefs in the kitchen or something like that?
To mix a metaphor.
But you know what I mean. You know what I mean.
I know what you mean.
So I mean, so taking to the extreme is all those things are problematic. I remember I was speaking with a mutual, and I wish I would have thought about this, because there was this YouTuber who put up these traits about how to be feminine, and of course, people on the left find that kind of stuff, very problematic.
Right.
And but the thing about those traits were that they were bad if you're forced to do them, but I saw good things about all of them. And sometimes I get the sense that what we do is we take the traits that have been foisted upon women. I think you said that. I like how that sounds. Have been foisted upon women as being bad or less than, and the traits that have been foisted on men as being better.
Wait, but we were just talking about how they're not good also.
That's true, actually. But you're saying that these things that women, not you in particular, but people say these things that women, like if you say submissiveness, that always sounds bad. But like communal values, empathy, nurturing, like these things are like
fantastic.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Those are wonderful things. Yeah. But it doesn't seem as if we want to push people in those directions as much. We want women to do more guy things, but we don't seem to go in the other way that much. Or maybe we do. Maybe I'm talking around myself, because we've just been talking about toxic masculinity, and so.
Yeah, it's definitely true that I think you hear people say to men, you need to be more empathetic, like a lot.
Yeah,
I don't know. I think that's like a common thing. And I absolutely believe that. Like, shit. How much of this could be just dealt with by men adopting some traits that have been historically women, right? Like, be more communal is the opposite of don't be excessively independent, right? Or don't be excessively I forget the word you said earlier. Individual,
self-reliant, I guess, or independent, something like that. No, you're right. Actually, I answered my own question. I mean, of course, we're asking men to do those things, and we do see those things as good. So, yeah.
Yeah, on some level, I think the thing that people probably took issue with that post that you're talking about is something that seems toxic femininity is enforcing gender norms on women and men. Something I've heard before, and I would really love to find the citation for it, because I at this point, I tried to fact check and I couldn't find the paper again, but a lot of the gender norms that are enforced on women are by other women, right? It's like, oh, honey, you don't look really good in that sweater or whatever, and it's like, why are you making me feel bad about the clothes I chose to wear today? So there is definitely like this component of femininity that enforces gender norms on young women. Certainly, like, I grew up in a Hispanic household. I didn't have any sisters, so this didn't play out for me. But for my girlfriend, one of my girlfriends at the time, she had a brother, but she was the one who was told to do all the dishes, to do the cleaning in the house, and the brother wasn't. And this was enforced by her mother, who did the same thing in her family. And I think like those types of like passing down, not just down, but adjacently, horizontally also, other women in your generation and the generations before you pass these like in these toxic femininity traits where you have to do certain things, you have to behave in certain ways, you have to like clean the house when men don't have to, for example. And I think those are problematic.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that totally. And I've had experiences like that as well, where I have a sister. She's 15 years younger than me, but she was kind of expected to do a lot of the home stuff, and still is, even in her marriage. And my mother sort of agrees with that, and sort of supports that idea. And so my brother-in-law kind of gets to play Xbox all the time. I shouldn't say that. He might happen to see this. He works hard, but he does get to have a little more free time at home. So
yeah,
yeah.
I try to subvert these. You know, I cook a lot. I try to clean. My girlfriend is definitely more conscientious than I am on just like a base like personality level. So I'm more okay with mess and like clutter than I think she is. And so, but I try to like play my part also. So hopefully it's something we won't replicate from the generations, something we will grow from. You know, we're improving.
You know, I had a conversation, I guess maybe a month ago, with a person on social media called Feminine House Bunny. And in that conversation, we just had a back and forth. And I realized that ultimately what we want is a situation where if men and women want to be traditionalists, she's a traditionalist, then they should be able to find each other. And we shouldn't ask them to not be that way. And at the same time, if people want to subvert those traditional roles and norms, then they should be able to find each other. And we shouldn't impose that sort of life on them as well. And that's kind of the way that I'm moving. Because if I'm honest with myself, as an academic, I understand the problems with patriarchy. And so, okay, on a political level, when it comes to voting and what I teach, okay, there's that academic theoretical level. I understand the reason why we push back. On a personal level, when it comes to dating, I actually like a lot of the traditional gender norms. I feel very good if I feel like I can take care of somebody and I feel like I have a purpose and meaning. And so what's happening is I'm starting to get this. I hope this is a more nuanced understanding of this issue, where you've got the general patriarchy we have to deal with, but also understanding that at the individual level, people should have a lot of choice and we shouldn't impose any of this on anybody.
Yeah, I'm fairly libertarian when it comes to those types of things. Like we had this conversation about sexual preferences too. Like somebody could want to be objectified and that can be their preference. And I'm very much like, if you've consented to that and that's your preference, then go by all means do it. And I think like the whole trad wife, trad husband kind of thing can also be in that same domain. I do think it takes on a political tenor, which
it does.
It becomes like a political platform. And I'm not sure if you were saying this, but I think maybe they might argue like, well, why is that any worse than a feminist saying like women should have more rights in their home or whatever? We're just saying the opposite of that. Why are we worse than they are? I disagree with that. I think that in general, the liberation of women has been to like not be in those gender roles has been good for women. I think the general.
Oh, wait, no. I'm saying, yeah, when it comes to our laws and stuff, we should make it so that there's choice in what people do, and we have to make sure that our laws are fair to men and women. None of this, men can only own property. I mean, that kind of stuff. I mean,
I meant within the context of a relationship.
Okay, like, within the context of a relationship, people should choose. So, like, if a female says, you know what, I feel most comfortable in a relationship where I am in the home and I manage the home like it's 1940 or something like that, and then my husband goes out and does all the work and I stay home. Those people shouldn't be seen as less than or seen as sexist or misogynist. It's just their personal choice.
I agree to a certain extent. I think like it's tough because a lot of women are born into a house that tells them to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And then they find a husband that enforces that same norm. And so where's the choice? If we can make a similar argument about, like, you know, I don't know if this is a cancelable opinion, but I feel like often we talk about, you know, cultures that do things quite differently. So, like, you know, the like, I guess more borderline case is like wearing hijab or being in a situation where you wear that. And a lot of women in those scenarios will say, well, I want to, it's part of my, like, it's part of my religious beliefs. But what does that mean in the context of a culture where you're also required to do that? And so what kind of choice is that? You'll say that you made this choice by your own hand, but then you also have a culture that's forcing you to make that same choice. And I think a lot of women can find themselves in that scenario too. Like, they haven't really had the opportunity to be in an equitable relationship with a person who really respects them. And so they're like, well, I actually like the trad wife approach, but they've been in a right-wing family their entire lives. So what does it mean?
Okay. All right. That's a good point. Now let's wrap up with this here. Can social science help us understand those challenges that we pointed out earlier? What can we as social scientists do?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, we've been talking about that this whole time, right? Like I said, like you said, we're pulling the stuff out of the literature. Like this description of the problem is coming out of the literature. I think social science is really helping us understand what's going on right now with men's issues in the first place. The other thing is that we need a check, right? Like, it's so easy to say this is a big problem. You need a check to, like, verify that as indeed a problem. Otherwise, you're just kind of pissing in the wind, and you don't know if you're, you know, if you're like tracking reality as it truly is. So I think that's just like a general way that social science helps us. But I think that there are, you know, at the end of the day, we have different explanations, right? Like, so we can talk about maybe institutions are unfriendly to men, and that's why they're not doing well in academia. Maybe it's a toxic masculinity thing. And so I think the social scientists are helping us track down which of those possibilities is closer aligned with the evidence. And so a good example of this is a paper called Manning Up by, I think it's Sapna Cherian, and it came out in 2015. And basically it shows that they had a study where they had people do a grip test. And it was a bunch of men. They did like a device where they have to grip it as hard as they can, and they were given feedback on how strong they gripped the mechanism. Mm-hmm. But they were given false feedback. And so they were shown two distributions, one of them male, one of them female. And they were like, your grip strength fell in the middle of the female distribution, or your grip strength fell within the male distribution. So basically, it was a way to, like, do a masculinity threat, right? If you were in the female distribution, you felt like,
yeah,
man, I guess I must be really weak in comparison. I'm more like a woman than I am like a man. Doesn't that sound like it would be pretty triggering?
So what happened? What happens when they?
Yeah. So when they did this, they found that men who were threatened in their masculinity had a lower preference for something that was a stereotypically feminine product, and that they also exaggerated their masculine traits. Like, they exaggerated their height, and they exaggerated the number of past sexual relationships, and they exaggerated the degree to which they're aggressive.
All right, they're compensating for their weak grip.
Right. And so this could be a component, right? So imagine the same study, and I think there have been some of these studies showing that if you threaten a man's masculinity, they're more likely to make excuses for a rapist, or they're more likely to not want to go to study in an academic setting. So this is the kind of evidence that would help us make a decision of, like, what is actually happening. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That's an interesting study. I think that more work needs to be done. Just in general, you mentioned that dichotomy of institutions versus individual men, and I think that's true. I mean, we just need to learn more about what's more important, but also just more. Like, I would like some ethnographies where a social scientist just follows around white men, not in the context of seeing how they're racist, but understanding how they're navigating a more sympathetic study, how they're navigating the world and what challenges they have. It may sound crazy to say, well, what kind of challenges do white men have? But I mean, every human being has some challenge. So I mean, doing that kind of research would give us some more data to work with. I also think we need more concepts. So if you talk about men's issues, the two things that always come out are patriarchy and toxic masculinity, which is what we're doing here. Well, we need more concepts and theories so we can have better conversations or more wide range conversations. Everything can't be reduced to those two ideas. So we just need more.
Yeah. I mean, I tend to think of those ideas as very broad. Like within those ideas there are umbrella ideas that, especially patriarchy is a huge umbrella that includes, I would say, toxic femininity, toxic masculinity, a bunch of other stuff that falls under that umbrella. And so it is true. Like we have to move on. We can't always be talking about the broadest level of analysis, right? Like you kind of have to go underneath that and look at more concepts. I think, yeah, totally. 100%.
Okay, Manuel, what are we going to talk about next?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I wait for you to get canceled on Twitter and then we can talk about whatever topic you're getting canceled on. I'm just kidding.
I've been pretty busy the last 2 weeks. I haven't been poking the bear as much. But the summer's coming, so I'll be back at it.
So you'll have time to poke the bear more.
Yeah. So I appreciate it, man. I always enjoy our conversations. And look, you're a really smart dude, and you say some interesting things. So I always learn something.
You too. I really love talking to you. I'm glad we're gonna do this more regularly.
Yeah, no doubt. Okay, Manuel, take care, man.
All right, take care.